Gurumba Bigi, or hello. It is my privilege today to speak on an issue I believe is vital in the development of our wider community. Before I begin, I would like to honour the traditional custodians of this land, the Turrbal people, and their elders past and present. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this community. Today I will be discussing Indigenous sovereignty in Australia and its impacts on Indigenous health. In particular, I will discuss whether the lack of a treaty with Indigenous Australians and the resulting lack of sovereignty and self-determination is a direct contributing factor to the failure of the Closing the Gap program. Established in 2008, the Closing the Gap program was an initiative designed to address the disproportionate levels of health, education, and social and political power experienced by Indigenous people compared to non-Indigenous Australians. After decades of efforts to address Indigenous marginalisation and disadvantage through various policies, Closing the Gap was established with 7 targets, including decreasing child mortality rate and increasing life expectancy rates, school attendance, and employment levels. However, the release of the annual Closing the Gap report earlier this year on its 10th anniversary was met with frustration from both government and Indigenous groups. Of the 7 targets, only 1 has seen true progress. Indigenous activists and advocates in particular highlighted the lack of consideration the Australian and state governments gave to input and recommendations from Indigenous leaders and groups, leading to its failure. They claimed that while the finances were provided and programs were established, very often these finances were not invested into appropriate areas, or the programs were irrelevant to the real issues Indigenous people were facing. The government concluded that a refresh of the program was needed and consulted Indigenous leaders in a 2-day meeting. However, Indigenous leaders were still frustrated by the lack of involvement and consultation Indigenous people had been offered over the last decade. While the Australian government claims to be working with Indigenous leaders in addressing the issues their people face, as Megan Davis highlights, the rejection of the Uluru Statement from the Heart is proof that they are not fully committed to Indigenous participation. So what does the lack of an Indigenous treaty have to do with these disappointing results of Closing the Gap? As the age of exploration progressed, Britain in particular amassed an empire of colonies. These colonies included the countries now known as Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. It is significant to note that of these former colonies, Australia is the only one which does not have a treaty with its Indigenous people. While the British colonisers acknowledged the inhabitation of these countries and established treaties with their Indigenous people, albeit often violently and forcefully, they adopted a skewed interpretation of the laws of property ownership and terra nullius in Australia. It should also be noted that Captain Cook was given explicit instructions concerning his exploration to the lands of the Southern Hemisphere. Instructions from the British Admiralty stated that Captain Cook possessed in the British name only land which was given by the inhabitants' consent, and through the cultivation of friendship, forced possession of land was not allowed. British philosopher and President of the Royal Society, James Douglas, wrote to Captain Cook, urging him to remember that the native inhabitants of the lands he would visit were the natural and, in the strictest sense of the word, the legal possessors of the several regions they inhabit. No European nation has the right to occupy any part of their country. Douglas believed that forced possession of land would be unlawful according to European property laws. However, due to Cook's reports that Australia was sparsely populated and its inhabitants less technologically advanced and knowing nothing of cultivation, the British justified the forced possession of Australia through terra nullius, unowned land. Terra nullius was based on ancient Greek and Roman property rights, where cultivation of the land was the basis for land rights. This theory was in direct contrast to the Indigenous hunter and gatherer societies and Indigenous values of sustainability and understanding of humans as custodians of the land. In order to justify their possession of land, Colonisers therefore disregarded the civilizations Indigenous people had established, including the legal systems in place. They established a British colony and thus began centuries-long exclusion of Indigenous people in Australian society, politics and policy making, including policies which directly and exclusively impacted Indigenous Australians. The exclusion of Indigenous people from participation in political activities has meant that there has been a lack of representation of Indigenous people and their needs in the Australian government. A lack of participation in mainstream society through policies of both segregation and forced cultural assimilation has also led to disadvantages in health and living conditions. The call for recognition of Indigenous Australians through a treaty has long been an aspect of Indigenous activism in Australia. The denial of Indigenous sovereignty through the skewed application of terra nullius has led to the exclusions of Indigenous people from social and political structures. For many advocates, a treaty is the acknowledgement of Indigenous existence. It is recognising and addressing the wrongs committed so long ago, which still have effects today, and it is about reconciling and uniting Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. Journalist John Pilger believes a treaty would establish an effective Bill of Rights for Indigenous people, which will then have legal ramifications in addressing Indigenous disadvantages. A treaty would establish sovereign equality between Indigenous people and the Australian government in order to negotiate terms of Indigenous participation within Australian society and reparations for past wrongs. As long as there is no treaty between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, the presence of British established rule in Australia remains illegal according to both the international laws and directives of the colonial time and Indigenous laws. Through a treaty, the recognition of Indigenous people as a state would support Indigenous sovereignty. Acknowledging the autonomy which was stolen from Indigenous peoples with the onset of colonisation, Article 3 of UNDRIP states that all Indigenous people have the right to self-determination. Eckermann defines self-determination as being the right of Indigenous peoples to choose their own destiny, with appropriate support from the government including finances, skills and social and economic support. Indigenous activism in Australia focused on sovereignty and self-determination during the 1970s, decades before the establishment of UNDRIP. During this time, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee was established with the aim to introduce Indigenous representatives into decision-making processes. Overall, the initiatives undertaken in this time were deemed a failure. The government moved away from self-determination towards self-management and other policies which since then have consecutively been deemed failures. Certainly, a lack of treaty at the point of colonisation makes it difficult for sovereignty to now be implemented through both legal and social barriers. Many Australians oppose sovereignty due to the difficulties they believe will occur in regards to land and property rights, as well as the misunderstanding of how a state within a state would operate. Statements made by politicians and government agents in regards to self-determination and sovereignty speak of a united Australia, and while these voice a positive, inclusive agenda, in actuality they deny the unique needs of Indigenous Australia, contrary to the core values of the UNDRIP in regard to unique needs and challenges of Indigenous people. Most recently, the Uluru Statement of the Heart called for the recognition of Indigenous laws and customs and the recognition of sovereignty of Australian lands. The statement, made jointly by Indigenous leaders from throughout Australia, highlights the structural nature of Indigenous issues and calls for reforms in both the Constitution and legal and social structures, including an Indigenous representative within government. The aim of representation within the Australian government would aim to increase and support self-determination of Indigenous Australians, as well as increase the power of Indigenous people within Australian politics and society. The Uluru Statement from the Heart also presented the concept of a Makarrata Commission, a commission to oversee agreement making between the Australian government and Indigenous groups. The Makarrata Commission derives its name from the Indigenous concept of reconciliation and healing after past wrongs. It would operate under the current constitution. However, the Turnbull government rejected this attempt by Indigenous leaders for reconciliation. Within a year, the annual Closing the Gap report was released, with further disappointments in terms of righting the wrongs of the past. The long history of the denial of Indigenous sovereignty in Australia has had direct and lasting impacts on the health and social and political power of Indigenous people. In particular, sovereignty is vital to the actuality of self-determination. With the 10-year anniversary report on the Closing the Gap program earlier this year, there were again calls for and against self-determination. Those for greater self-determination policies emphasise the need for increased participation and consultation of Indigenous people. Many argued that just as during the 1970s, the processes of self-determination had not succeeded, while others claimed true self-determination had never been appropriately established. So often, self-determination has been given to Indigenous people without appropriate support. Self-determination does not necessarily mean to completely segregate a group from the rest of society. However, it does mean that the group is able to decide how best they apply the resources available to them, including the rights and privileges afforded to all citizens within the context of their unique needs and culture. Indigenous cultural needs also mean their values and priorities will differ to those of non-Indigenous Australians, such as the need for connection to the land and the emphasis on group rights over individual rights. The grand plans by the Australian government to refresh the Closing the Gap program will prove to be futile so long as Indigenous sovereignty continues to be denied. It is inefficient and inappropriate for programs like Closing the Gap to be developed and implemented without sufficient consultation and direction from Indigenous leaders, sufficient being total control of Indigenous people through self-determination. Self-determination is the right of Indigenous people to determine how they will live and govern themselves without the interference and imposition of Eurocentric systems and structures. For many Indigenous people, the introduction of colonial structures spelled the destruction of their own cultures and the oppression of Indigenous people collectively. Genocides, forced removal of children, segregation, racism, slavery, and limited access to rights placed Indigenous people outside of mainstream society. From the onset of European presence in Australia, Indigenous people were denied political power within Australia through the skewed application of terra nullius. This disparity continued throughout the centuries. The lack of political authority for Indigenous people has ensured they will be made second-rate citizens within their own homeland and ensured a lack of advocacy power. This oppression has led to significant gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in terms of physical and mental health, education, economic stability, and social and political power. Indigenous people continue to experience significantly higher rates of mortality, violence, and incarceration. While the Australian government has attempted to address these disadvantages, there has been a long history of failure of programs. The lack of a treaty and resulting sovereignty and self-determination are a direct contributor for the continued failure of programs, including the Closing the Gap program. The disappointing results of Closing the Gap in its 10th year have caused the government to call for a refresh of the program. However, activists are adamant that so long as Indigenous people are not given appropriate power within determining how programs should be implemented, the program will not succeed. The recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and structures, and the constitutional and social reforms as proposed by the Uluru Statement of the Heart, would establish a social and political atmosphere which would see greater success of initiatives like Closing the Gap. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your continued support of Indigenous people.